In the 1990s, Seattle was a city standing at a strange crossroads, a place quietly poised between its blue-collar roots and the global spotlight that would soon land on it with full force. It was still a city defined by rain, fog, and a certain offbeat charm that made it feel different from the polished metropolises of Los Angeles or New York. Back then, Seattle hadn't yet become synonymous with tech giants and skyrocketing rent. It was still a working port town with sawdust in its veins, a place where the industrial past clung to the edges of every dock, every warehouse, every diner with cracked linoleum floors and bottomless drip coffee. At the beginning of the decade, the atmosphere was sleepy, introspective, and unmistakably odd in the best way. You could rent an entire craftsman house with a backyard for the cost of a used guitar. Baristas lived in group houses, shared utilities, and played in 2 bands each. Artists squatted in forgotten buildings, painting murals by day and bartending by night. Musicians could get by on part-time jobs, slinging espresso or washing dishes, and still afford to live in entire homes in neighborhoods like Ballard, Fremont, or the Central District. Capitol Hill was still gritty, still affordable, and very much the nucleus of the city's creative energy. The streets weren't yet scrubbed clean, and that was exactly how people liked it. Grunge hadn't yet become a marketable aesthetic. It was still just what people wore. Ripped jeans weren't sold at Nordstrom. Thrift store sweaters were actually bought from Value Village out of necessity. The local music scene was simmering, ready to boil over, and in spots like the OK Hotel, Bar, and the Crocodile Cafe, you could feel something taking shape. Belltown, now sterilized and redeveloped beyond recognition, was a hub for weirdos, musicians, and late-night wanderers. The U District had a constant buzz from the University of Washington, giving it a restless, slightly chaotic energy. Bands were forming in basements and garages, and kids with secondhand guitars were dreaming up sounds that would soon travel the globe. South Lake Union was another world entirely. What's now home to corporate campuses, upscale condos, and fast casual salad chains was, at the time, mostly empty. It was a dead zone of cracked pavement, run-down warehouses, and forgotten marine supply shops. If you had to be in South Lake Union after sunset, you kept your keys in hand and your eyes open. There were no tourists, no cyclists, no food trucks. The buildings had the look of abandonment, and the few people who passed through were usually on their way to somewhere else. It felt like the kind of place where you could shoot a noir film without needing to dress the set. The traffic was annoying, sure. Mercer had its problems, as it always has, but in hindsight, it was laughably manageable. If you were running late, you could still make it from Ballard to Capitol Hill in under 20 minutes, with a little luck and a heavy foot. Street parking wasn't a myth yet. There were still empty lots. People didn't stare at their phones at every red light. It was a different rhythm, slower, messier, more human. Downtown Seattle, especially after dark, had its own pulse, sometimes thrilling, sometimes threatening. It wasn't sanitized, and that was part of its draw. After 8 p.m., downtown belonged to the night people. It was a mix of club kids, street punks, working girls, off-shift cooks, and music fans chasing a set list scrawled on a bathroom wall. First Avenue had a grimy charm, like a haunted carnival that never shut down. You might pass by a strip club with a blinking neon sign, a pawn shop still open at midnight, a record store blasting the Melvins, and a line of kids waiting to get into a venue that probably violated fire codes. It was alive in the way that only imperfect places can be. Pioneer Square carried an uneasy dual identity. It was a historic district with art galleries, brick buildings, and real architectural soul, but it was also a place where things could get dangerous fast. You might head down there to catch a jazz trio playing in a basement bar, only to end the night dodging a fight spilling out of a dive. It wasn't a neighborhood for the faint of heart, but it had a magnetic pull for those who didn't mind a little friction. There was a sense of the unexpected, of anything being possible, sometimes inspiring, sometimes regrettable. The early 1990s in Seattle felt unvarnished, a little rough around the edges, and refreshingly unpretentious. The city hadn't yet been carved up by tech booms, chain developments, or luxury condos. It was a place where you could still breathe, still hear yourself think, and still find parking without circling the block for 20 minutes. There were fewer places to eat, sure, but what was available had its own charm and grit. You could grab a paper-wrapped teriyaki plate from a family-run spot, a greasy slice of pizza for a couple bucks, or a burger that felt like it came straight off someone's backyard grill. Espresso wasn't a performance art yet. It was just strong, hot, and exactly what you needed after standing in the rain, waiting for the bus. Cafe culture was already woven into the fabric of the city, but it was a different kind of scene. These weren't minimalist temples of curated playlists and plant walls. Coffee shops were chaotic and cozy. Mismatched chairs, thrifted couches, local artwork tacked to the walls, flyers for punk shows on the bulletin boards. The baristas knew your name, or at least your drink, and half of them were in bands, or zines, or performance art collectives. It wasn't performative, it was just what people did. You went to the cafe to write, to read, to meet up with your weird friends, and argue about music, or marks, or the best Thai place in the ID. Crime was a part of the equation, and nobody really tried to pretend otherwise. Muggings happened, car break-ins were expected. Belltown, back then, had a reputation for being gritty, not hip, not buzzy, just a little bit dangerous and definitely unpredictable. First Avenue could feel like a gauntlet after dark, and you didn't walk it with your headphones in. The Central District still carried the weight of redlining and disinvestment, and certain stretches near the old Kingdom felt like you were walking through a forgotten zone, half ghost town, half open-air market of sketchy deals. But even with all that, there was a strange sense of acceptance. People weren't shocked by it. There was a certain understanding. This is the city, this is how it is. Neighborhoods weren't polished or curated, but they were alive. They had edge, tension, and stories baked into every cracked sidewalk and flickering streetlight. The Seattle Police Department in that era wasn't exactly winning community trust either. Their reputation preceded them, aggressive, reactive, and often completely indifferent to public perception. Incidents didn't always make headlines, but everyone had a story about a friend who got shoved, searched, or worse. Protests, especially in Capitol Hill and the U District, often turned tense. There wasn't much faith in accountability, and yet, life went on. What made it all matter, what gave the city its heartbeat, was the soul that pulsed through its music. Seattle didn't just catch a break with grunge. It became the epicenter of a global shift in culture. But the beauty of it was that before the fame, before MTV and Rolling Stone covers, the musicians were still just part of the fabric. You'd see Kurt Cobain in a thrifted sweater at a show in a basement. Chris Cornell might be at a dive bar, quiet in the corner. Lane Staley had friends in your building. Eddie Vedder looked like someone who'd asked to borrow a lighter. These weren't untouchable icons yet. They were just there, part of the same weird weather and coffee addiction and late-night wanderings as everyone else. The city felt small enough that running into someone famous didn't feel like spotting a celebrity. It felt like bumping into a neighbor. As the decade rolled forward, the mid-90s delivered something else Seattle had been hungry for, a sense of pride that came from outside the music scene. The Mariners, who had long been a lovable but losing franchise, pulled off the impossible in 1995. The playoff run that year wasn't just a good season, it was salvation. The Kingdom was packed, Griffey was unstoppable, and Edgar Martinez became a legend with one perfect swing. The city rallied around them not just because they were winning, but because it felt like Seattle was finally winning. That single postseason may have saved baseball in the city entirely, stopping the franchise from being uprooted and sent to Florida. The Seattle SuperSonics were electric. The energy in Key Arena during the Shawn Kemp and Gary Payton era was unmatched. Payton's swagger and trash talk were pure theater, but backed by talent. Kemp was gravity-defying, pulling off dunks that made jaws drop and fans roar. Even though they fell short in the 1996 finals, the city was hooked. Basketball wasn't just a sport here. It was a movement. Sonics gear was everywhere. Kids reenacted Kemp's dunks on cracked playground courts, and everyone hated the Bulls for just being too damn good. As the decade moved forward, Seattle began to smooth out the rough, gritty edges that had long defined its character. What had once been a city of fringe culture and underground energy started to feel curated, cleaner, and increasingly commodified. Coffee, once the unofficial religion of artists and insomniacs, stopped being just something you grabbed at a mismatched cafe table next to a sleeping poet. It became a lifestyle, a logo, a global product, thanks in large part to the rise of Starbucks, which transformed Seattle's humble coffee obsession into a worldwide empire. That shift was symbolic of something deeper. It wasn't just about coffee, it was about identity. The city that had once taken pride in its scruff and skepticism began leaning into marketability. What used to be intimate started to feel packaged. The grunge scene, once the raw and untamed voice of a generation, lost momentum. Nirvana was gone. Soundgarden and Alice in Chains were burning out. The punk shows and basement gigs didn't disappear, but they stopped feeling like they were the center of the universe. In their place, tech quietly moved in. Microsoft was already an economic force in the region, but now it started to feel culturally dominant. And then came Amazon. At first, just a quirky startup peddling books online, headquartered in a nondescript building. Nobody could have guessed how deeply it would embed itself into the city's DNA. The neighborhoods began to change in ways that felt subtle at first, but snowballed fast. Fremont, with its Lenin statue and quirky street festivals, had once been the irreverent heart of Seattle weirdness. It was a place for burners, sculptors, zine makers, and barefoot drummers. But as rents crept up, the very people who gave Fremont its offbeat soul found themselves priced out by boutique shops and software engineers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The center of the universe was becoming a little more sterile with each passing year. Ballard's transformation was slower, but just as telling. Once a sleepy Scandinavian fishing neighborhood filled with dive bars, taverns, and generations of working-class families, Ballard began attracting a different crowd, the kind of people who wanted the charm without the grime. At first, it was a new cafe or yoga studio here and there. Then came the condo developments, the gastropubs, and the craft cocktail menus. The fish bars were still around, but the scent of cedar and salmon was slowly giving way to the aroma of artisan pizza and cold brew. By the late 1990s, the change was no longer a slow drift. It was a tide. South Lake Union, once a ghost town of warehouses, boatyards, and dead zones, started drawing attention from developers. What had felt like forgotten space suddenly looked like opportunity. People talked about revitalization, a word that often signaled the beginning of the end for anything authentically gritty. Construction cranes dotted the skyline. Streets that once echoed with silence now buzzed with the hum of transformation. Still, the old Seattle hadn't disappeared entirely. Tower Records still stood proudly, offering aisles of CDs and handwritten staff pics. The Crocodile Cafe was still alive with guitar feedback and sweaty crowds. The lusty lady on First Avenue kept its cheeky neon winking at passers-by. A final holdout against the encroaching wave of glass towers and upscale retail. But everything around these cultural landmarks was changing. The new buildings were shinier, the sidewalks were cleaner, the prices were higher. A sense of urgency filled the air, not just in real estate, but in the hearts of those who felt the city they loved slipping away. Seattle in the 1990s had a kind of magic that's hard to explain unless you lived it. You could hold down a part-time job at a record store, share a weird old apartment with friends who played in noise bands, and still have enough left over to grab dinner at a faux spot, or see a show at a club where the floor was always sticky and the sound was always a little too loud. Artists, musicians, poets, and punks didn't just exist here. They thrived. They filled the city with color and noise and wild, untamed dreams. You knew your neighbors. You knew the bartender. You knew the guy who sold comics from his garage. There was grit, sure, and crime and weird politics, but it all felt human, alive. The rain was constant, and the clouds hung low, but people wore it like a badge. Umbrellas were for tourists. Real Seattleites let the drizzle soak into their thrifted flannels and denim jackets. The city had its flaws, plenty of them, but they were part of the charm. It was a place where things weren't perfect, and nobody pretended otherwise. If you were there during that decade, you probably remember the feeling, that weird, specific thrill of living in a place that felt like a secret, like a song you didn't want the radio to find. It was odd and moody and occasionally dangerous, but it was yours. The skyline was shorter, the nights were darker, and the soul of the city was unpolished and unafraid. And maybe, at some point, while walking home from a bar on Capitol Hill at 2 a.m., or biking along the Burke-Gilman Trail with a hangover, or watching the fog roll in from Puget Sound, you thought to yourself, this place is strange and stubborn and wonderful. I hope it stays this way forever. And then, of course, it didn't.
Joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you.